The arena air was thick with the scent of spent pyro and disappointment. For 20 minutes, the crowd had sat on their hands, trapped in a silence that wasn't born of respect, but of resignation. In the center of the ring, the champion stood with a microphone that felt more like a weapon than a tool of communication. He had dismantled every hero, broken every legend, and ridiculed the very concept of hope. The commentary team sounded defeated, their voices barely rising above a monotone drone as they tried to sell the dominance of a man who had simply run out of challengers. A few fans near the barricade were already rolling up their posters, turning their backs to beat the traffic, convinced that the show was over long before the copyright graphic appeared. There was no buzzing anticipation tonight, no rumors on the internet, no leaked photos from the airport. The dirt sheets were dry. The world was convinced that this specific book was closed, the pages glued shut by time and bad blood. The champion laughed, a sound that echoed off the empty rafters, mocking the very idea that anyone was left to stand in his way. He raised the title, signaling the production crew to cut the feed. The referee signaled for the bell to end the segment. The cameraman began to lower his lens. The exhaustion in the building was palpable, a heavy gray fog of inevitability. And then, in the space between a breath and a heartbeat, the impossible happened. The arena lights didn't just dim, they died, a total suffocating blackout that swallowed the champion's laughter whole. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then, a single, distorted guitar chord shredded the darkness, a sound so familiar yet so forgotten that it felt like a ghost walking over a grave. The reaction wasn't a cheer, it was a detonation. It was the sound of 20,000 people losing their minds simultaneously, a primal roar that physically shook the hard cam. The darkness was pierced by a single spotlight hitting the top of the stage, revealing a silhouette that hadn't been seen in a WWE ring for 7 years. The commentary headsets nearly clipped out. No, this isn't real," shouted the play-by-play announcer, his voice cracking from professional composure into sheer fanboy disbelief. He vowed never to step foot in this company again. "What is seeing? What are we hearing?" The silhouette didn't move. He just stood there, soaking in a wall of sound that felt like a jet engine taking off inside a closet. Pyrotechnics erupted, not the standard fanfare, but a blinding wall of gold and white fire that signaled the arrival of a deity. The champion in the ring dropped the microphone, clattered loudly on the canvas, audible even over the mayhem. His face, previously masked in arrogance, drained of color, he looked like a man who had seen his own mortality walking down the ramp. The returnee began the walk slow, methodical, predatory. He didn't play to the crowd. He didn't smile. He stared straight ahead with eyes that burned with a controlled, terrifying intensity. The barricades bowed as fans surged forward just to touch the hem of history. They said hell would freeze over, the color commentator whispered, barely audible over the chanting that had now synchronized into a deafening rhythm of the legend's name. This wasn't just a return. It was a hostile takeover. The atmosphere shifted from a wrestling show to a religious event. The prodigal son hadn't just returned. He had come back to burn the house down. The music cut. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. The two men stood nose to nose in the center of the ring. The champion, usually a giant among men, suddenly looked small. He tried to puff his chest, to regain the alpha stance, but the legend simply tilted his head, a microscopic movement that screamed total psychological dominance. You could hear the camera shutters clicking like frantic heartbeats. The legend didn't raise a fist. He simply raised a microphone, yet he didn't speak. He looked at the hard camera, then at the champion, and smiled, a cold, sad smile that said more than 1,000 promos. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the catchphrase, the punchline, the nostalgia pop. It never came. Instead, the legend dropped the mic, mirroring the champion's earlier arrogance, and delivered a single, open-hand slap. The sound echoed like a gunshot, and it wasn't a wrestling move. It was a disrespect so profound it sucked the air out of the room. The champion stumbled back, eyes wide, paralyzed by the sheer audacity. The commentary team was stunned into silence. "He didn't come back to wrestle," the announcer breathed. "Came back to discipline." The legend turned his back, the ultimate insult, and walked to the ropes, holding them open for the champion to leave his own ring. The symbolism was crushing. The unbeatable god was being dismissed like a child, When the champion hesitated, the legend spun around and the violence exploded. A short-arm clothesline turned the champion inside out. It was messy, real, and desperate. This wasn't a choreographed dance. It was a street fight between the past and the present was getting battered. The broadcast ended with the legend standing tall, but the real drama was just beginning. As the copyright logo faded, social media platforms began to crash. #HeisBack trended #1 globally within 4 minutes, eclipsing major news events and political scandals. But backstage, the atmosphere was chaotic. Producers were scrambling, shouting into headsets, trying to figure out if the segment had gone over time or if the script had been thrown out entirely. In the locker room, the current roster watched the monitors in stunned silence. Young stars who had spent years building their brand realized in an instant that their spot on the WrestleMania card was now in jeopardy. The hierarchy had been shattered. The glass ceiling they complained about had just been reinforced with concrete. The champion, usually protected by handlers, stormed through the curtain. Kicking over equipment cases, screaming about unprofessionalism, blurring the lines between storyline and legitimate rage. Meanwhile, the legend's family, hidden away in a private bus, watched with tears in their eyes. They knew the cost. They knew the surgeries, the rehab, and the late-night doubts that led to this moment. The media scrum waiting outside the arena was frantic, reporters shouting questions at tinted windows. Was this a one-time appearance? Was it a retirement tour? The stock price of the company jumped 3 points in after-hours trading. The shockwave wasn't just emotional, it was financial. The return had disrupted the entire ecosystem of the industry. It forced everyone, from the writers to the shareholders, to rip up their plans for the next 6 months. The neatly organized world of sports entertainment had just been thrown into beautiful, profitable anarchy. As the adrenaline faded and the arena emptied, a strange melancholy settled over the online discourse. The initial rush of "he's back" gave way to a deeper, more reflective realization. Fans began dissecting the footage frame by frame. They noticed the gray in his beard that hadn't been dyed. They noticed the slight limp he tried to hide during his exit. They saw the way he looked at the lights, not with triumph, but with a kind of desperate gratitude. This wasn't the return of a superhero who was going to save the day forever. This was the final lap. The controlled intensity was a mask for a man who knew his time was borrowed. The twist wasn't in the storyline. It was in the reality of the moment. We thought we were watching a conquest, a king returning to his throne. But looking closer at his eyes during that final close-up, we realized we were watching a goodbye. He hadn't come back to win the title. He hadn't come back for the money or the fame. He came back because he needed to hear that sound one last time to know he still existed. The shock wasn't that he returned. Shock was realizing that he was just as scared of the end as we were. The controlled intensity was actually fear that once the lights went out this time, they would never come back on. And as the screen faded to black, the audience was left with the haunting realization that the greatest entrance of the decade was actually the beginning of the longest exit.